And you know, this topic is so near and dear to me because having conducted over 500 meetings over the last couple of years, and in those meetings listened to over 500 sessions of just pure Q&A, I'm always amazed at the challenges people deal with and are confronted with. And if you weave through all the maze, all the preliminary points to their questions, so often it has to deal with a boundary that's being violated, or a difficult relationship with a person in their family, or stress without knowing how to balance truth with grace, or feeling condemned because they feel the need to confront or address something, or simply falsely assuming that tolerance is what we're called to do as Christians when there are issues or areas that need to be confronted. So we want to talk about difficult conversations, how to have that conversation that you've been avoiding. Now, one of the sad byproducts of not addressing issues is that you get all the negative emotions of your problems without the benefit of having them solved. In other words, avoiding conversations, avoiding issues that need to be raised simply prolong the pain. And you get all the negative side effects of it. And generally what happens is when you avoid the conversation long enough, or when you don't raise it, it usually surfaces, listen, the issue that you've been avoiding addressing usually surfaces when you can't address it effectively. You've had this nagging feeling, but because you've avoided the conversation, or you've avoided the perceived pain that the conversation will bring, it usually surfaces or raises its ugly head when you can least address it effectively. Let me give you a couple of examples. For some, it may be a drinking problem that they've had with their spouse that's not being addressed effectively, but it gets most of their attention at family get-togethers or family reunions when it can't be addressed effectively. And it just becomes an energy drain. It just siphons off energy. You avoided having it, but now you've had all the problems of it without any of the benefits of a potential solution. Another example might be a son who's bugged you for years or has challenged you for years because of character issues, but you didn't want to bring it up, and now they flunked out of college. Or they get sent home for drug abuse. Or even a worst case scenario, they end up in prison. In other words, you avoided it, and now when it raises its ugly head, you're trying to address it at the least effective time. Or for some, perhaps it's a tax issue, something related to the IRS. And you've had this nagging feeling, but you know what happens? It comes to your mind, or you're losing sleep at night when you can't do anything at night. You should be sleeping, not thinking about the tax issue. In other words, it comes to you, you've avoided it, and it surfaces or it raises its head when you can least effectively address it. Or it may be an outstanding debt, or your credit. And it's an issue that needs to be addressed, but you don't think about it, or you don't address it, and then all of a sudden you apply for a mortgage. Or for others, it might be you've had this nagging feeling, I need to fix something with my car. I hear something underneath the hood. But what happens is it starts eating at you most when you're en route to a very important appointment. What's my point? I just gave several scenarios where avoidance was not your friend. Avoidance in the long run just caused you more pain and then allow you to experience the benefits of addressing it. And that's how difficult conversations are. You want to make sure that you have it before it rears its ugly head. Now, before we get into this aspect of our teaching, I wanted to just highlight something because I listened to it 5 years ago. It's hard to believe. We did I think, one of our best teaching series, and I'm amazed it's one of our most undersubscribed ones, called Crazy Folks. And it's funny because I called it difficult people, and then I felt convicted. So the second week I called it crazy folks. Then I went back to difficult people, so then I just ended up calling it difficult people / crazy folks. But I want to highlight some of the aspects of that teaching, because before we get into difficult conversations or how to have that conversation that you've been avoiding, you need to be able to differentiate between, is this a conversation that you can have in the first place, or is the person that you're dealing with a difficult person / crazy folk, in which case boundaries need to be erected. And this is interesting because I found boundaries are a topic that Christians really have a hard time getting their arms around. It seems as though there's an embedded feeling that tolerance is what is needed. And when you tolerate something, you just allow the monster within the other person to grow larger. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to confront. So we want to, even before we start talking about having these conversations, we want to make a distinction, because it's very clear to me in my own life, I've seen it very readily, that there's some people that I'm not even supposed to be having that difficult conversation with. Or once I've had it and I've discerned their response, my next course of action is to erect a boundary. My next course of action is to protect myself. Because you have to discern who you're graced to deal with and who you're not graced to deal with. Oftentimes, you'll see this happen in families where you're not graced to reach out to that loved one because of proximity, because it's your sibling, because it's a parent-child dynamic. You're not graced to. And even when you think about the Bible tells us to pray that laborers will come across their path. The Bible doesn't say pray that you'll get more anointed till they start believing you. It says you pray that laborers will come across their path, that they can speak the truth in love to. So we need tremendous discernment. Now, as I said, for some reason as believers, we think tolerance or super duper long suffering is what God calls us to do, but that's not true. Or in some cases, people say that the answer to it is prayer. Well, the Bible, that's one of the answers to challenging situations, but the Bible speaks of other things like confrontation. In fact, turn to Matthew 18 for a second. Matthew 18 is an excellent scripture that basically, if someone says, as it relates to dealing with challenging people or having difficult conversations, Matthew 18, if someone said, Chris, summarize what is, in your opinion, what is the essence of dealing with a brother who's sinning or dealing with a challenging situation? If I had to summarize this verse or this text in one sentence, it would be increasing levels of peer pressure. Increasing levels of peer pressure. Now, that's very important because most of us are trying to change people, which you can't, by one-on-one or by using our clever talk. But at times, the Bible speaks of increasing levels of peer pressure. Look at this. Matthew 18, verse 15, it says, moreover, if a brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Okay, that's the first step. But many of us, that's where we get in trouble, where we've gone alone, we've had a one-on-one conversation, and it hasn't yielded a fruit, it hasn't yielded a change in the behavior. There's still something that needs to be addressed. There's still something that's endangering the family or endangering the individual. This says, go and tell him his fault alone, and if he hears you, you have gained a brother. But if he will not hear you, take with you one or two more. What are we talking about? Increasing levels of peer pressure. And by the mouth of two or three witnesses, let every word be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell the church. But if he refuses to even hear the church, let him be to you like a brother, like a heathen or a tax collector. Now, this rarely happens, but part of the role of spiritual family, part of the role and responsibility of church, as is outlined in Matthew 18, is to provide increasing levels of peer pressure so that issues can be confronted. A perfect example is a man is challenged with porn, and his wife goes to him alone. And he says, oh, you're being oversensitive, or I can't help myself, or I'm Mr. Wandering Eyes, or this is just who I am, or this is how God made me. Then this verse says most women get stuck there. But this verse says, no, then you go to another man, hopefully, that he respects, so that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, then you can elevate it. What's happening? Increasing levels of peer pressure.